The hum of voices and the clinking of luggage wheels filled the crowded terminal of Skyline International Airport. It was another busy morning, as passengers hustled to their gates, each lost in their own world, headed to destinations across the country. Marcus Johnson stood near the gate, his fingers lightly tapping against the sleek, silver handle of his carry-on bag. His eyes drifted over the bustling crowd, his mind lost in thought, wondering if the few days of escape from his usual life in the corporate world would be enough to give him the clarity he was desperately seeking. Marcus wasn't a man who usually sought attention, especially in places like airports, where anonymity was a rare luxury. But today, there was something different about him. He wasn't the young executive eager to prove himself. He was just a man, caught between the expectations of his father's massive legacy and his own desire to live a life of his own choosing. Jeremiah Johnson, his father, was the head of Skyline Airlines, a company that had risen from humble beginnings to dominate the aviation industry. People knew the name, but few knew the son. His mind wandered back to the phone call he had received that morning, a reminder of the responsibility he was expected to carry. His father wanted him to attend a meeting, a mere formality for someone of his status. "Come on, Marcus, it's time to take your place," Jeremiah had said, his voice thick with the weight of family tradition. Marcus had tried to brush off the feeling of suffocation, but today, it was harder than usual. He had told his assistant he needed some time away. Time to think. Time to breathe. That was why, today, he had booked a last-minute flight to New York, alone. No meetings, no press conferences. Just him, a flight, and some quiet moments of introspection. He checked his watch, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as he saw the flight was on time. As he moved toward the gate, he passed a few familiar faces, businessmen in expensive suits, young families with excited children, and elderly couples. But there was one face that caught his attention, and it was the one that would change everything. Jessica, the flight attendant, stood by the gate with a clipboard in her hands, scanning the crowd for passengers who were boarding. She was in her early 30s, with short, chestnut hair pulled back into a neat bun. Her uniform was impeccable, the dark blue fabric of her skirt and jacket sharply contrasting with her pale skin. She looked like she had done this 1,000 times before, moving effortlessly between the passengers, offering polite smiles and greetings. But as Marcus approached the gate, ready to board the first-class cabin that was always reserved for him, his family's influence ensuring his seat, he saw Jessica look at his ticket and then glance back at him, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. It was only for a second, but it was enough. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a tone that could only be described as professional but firm. "I'm afraid there's been a mix-up with your reservation." Marcus blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He was used to this process. He was used to walking past the velvet ropes, to the polite nods of the gate attendants, and the knowing glances exchanged with the other first-class passengers. But this? This was new. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," he replied, trying to mask the confusion creeping up his throat. "I'm supposed to be in first class." Jessica flipped through her clipboard, scanning the names on the list again. "I'm afraid your ticket is not listed for first class, sir. It's showing economy class, actually. If you'd like, I can direct you to the proper gate." Marcus frowned, the tension in his jaw tightening. "There's no mistake," he said, his voice slightly sharper than he intended. "I'm Marcus Johnson. My father owns this airline. Jessica's eyes met his for a brief second, but there was no sign of recognition. "I'm sorry, sir," she cut him off. "As I said, your reservation is for economy class. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside and allow the other passengers to board. I'm sure we can sort this out when we land." Marcus stood there, stunned. He had been through this routine hundreds of times before. He had never been stopped at the gate, never had his reservation questioned. This wasn't how things worked. His family's name carried weight, and with that weight came certain privileges. His father, Jeremiah Johnson, didn't build an airline empire just to have his son treated like this. "Look, I don't think you understand," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady, his patience running thin. "I'm not just any passenger. My father is the CEO of this airline. This is a mistake." Jessica's expression remained polite but unwavering. "I'm just following the system, sir," she said, her tone even and calm. "If you would step aside, I'll make sure someone from customer service takes care of this when we land." A wave of frustration swept over Marcus, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. Did she seriously not know who he was? How could she not recognize the name? How could she not recognize him? Before he could respond, another passenger, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, approached, nodding politely at Jessica as he presented his boarding pass. Without missing a beat, she smiled and handed him a first-class ticket. Marcus' blood began to boil. He felt the weight of every eye on him, the silent judgment that came with being a person who couldn't be seen as just another face in the crowd. He wanted to snap, to demand an apology, but something inside him hesitated. Instead, he took a deep breath, his mind swirling with the realization that his wealth and his last name meant nothing to this woman. To her, he was just another passenger. "Fine," Marcus muttered, walking away. "I'll take my seat in economy class." As he made his way to the economy section of the plane, the harsh reality of the situation set in. This wasn't the life he had expected. This wasn't the world he had known, and maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand why. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Marcus Johnson leaned back into his seat as the plane took off, the soft hum of the engines a constant reminder that he was once again on his way somewhere that he didn't really want to be. He stared out of the small window, watching as the city below slowly became a blur of lights and buildings. This wasn't the kind of flight that would bring him peace, not like the ones he used to take as a child, sitting beside his father on private jets, their world so far removed from the average passengers. The story of Marcus's life wasn't one that could easily be shared in a few sentences. He wasn't just any young man, he was Marcus Johnson, son of Jeremiah Johnson, the founder and CEO of Skyline Airlines, a man whose name had become synonymous with success, power, and wealth in the airline industry. The company, which started as a small regional carrier years ago, had grown into one of the largest airlines in the world, flying millions of passengers every year. But while his father's empire had expanded, Marcus had always felt like an outsider within it. From a young age, Marcus had been told he was destined for greatness. He was always surrounded by people who reminded him of his family's status, the private tutors, the exclusive events, the endless expectations. He was raised in a mansion that could rival any palace, with servants at his disposal, private jets waiting at the touch of a button, and the kind of wealth that most people could only dream of. But none of it ever felt like his own. Unlike his father, who embraced the role of being the powerful CEO, Marcus had always been more withdrawn, more introspective. He often found himself longing for something more, something deeper than the shallow pool of riches and corporate power that surrounded him. Marcus wanted to make a difference in the world, but not the way his father did. He didn't want to wield his wealth as a shield against the world, but as a bridge to understanding it. He wanted to be seen as more than just the heir to an empire. Growing up, Marcus had always found solace in books and in the quiet spaces of his home, far from the social events his father insisted on attending. It wasn't that he hated his life, but the world around him felt suffocating. He envied the freedom of the people who lived on the other side of the tracks, those who didn't have a family name to uphold, whose lives were not controlled by the expectations of others. He could never truly escape his family's shadow. No matter where he went or what he did, Marcus always carried the weight of being Jeremiah Johnson's son. The phone call from his father had come as a sharp reminder of that weight. "Marcus, I need you at the meeting tomorrow. It's time for you to step up." His father had a way of speaking that made it impossible to refuse. Jeremiah wasn't the kind of man who asked for things gently. He made demands, and they were always to be followed. There was no room for weakness in his world. And yet, Marcus had always resisted. He had been to meetings before, sitting quietly in the corner, a silent observer to his father's world of high-stakes business and corporate maneuvers. The endless chatter about profits, expansion, and the future of the airline. But it all felt meaningless to him. He had never been interested in increasing the family fortune. It had never been about the money for him. Growing up in that world, Marcus had developed a sense of detachment, even from his own family. He loved his father, but the connection they shared was always distant, built more on duty than on affection. Jeremiah was always busy, always consumed by the demands of the airline, and Marcus, in turn, had learned to live with the idea that he was just another cog in the machine. It wasn't until Marcus was older that he realized his father's expectations for him weren't just about being successful in business. They were about continuing the legacy. His father never asked if Marcus wanted to run the airline, it was assumed. Marcus had always been expected to carry the torch, even though he had no interest in holding it. But now, sitting on this flight to New York, he had a choice to make. Was he going to continue living in the shadow of his father's legacy, or was he going to step out into the world on his own terms? Would he ever be able to find his own identity apart from the name Johnson? The name that had opened doors for him, yes, but also closed others. As the plane ascended into the sky, Marcus's mind wandered back to his early years. He remembered the trips to the airport with his father, the long car rides to corporate meetings, and the air of authority that his father carried wherever he went. He remembered how his father would shake hands with dignitaries and executives, always the center of attention, while Marcus stood silently by his side, feeling like a bystander in his own life. It was hard to forget how often people would speak to him as if they were speaking to a shadow of his father. "Your father is doing great things," they'd say, as if he were somehow an extension of the empire rather than a person in his own right. It had always irritated him, though he never showed it. People saw only the name. They didn't see him, the quiet, thoughtful person who just wanted to be recognized for his own abilities. But now, as he sat on the plane, Marcus was beginning to wonder if he would ever be able to escape the family name. Would he ever be able to carve out his own path, or would he forever be known as Jeremiah Johnson's son? And more importantly, did he even want to? As the hours passed, the world outside the window faded into a blanket of clouds. Marcus's thoughts grew heavier, the weight of his past pressing in on him from all sides. But something else was also growing, a sense of determination. Maybe it was time to stop running from who he was. Maybe it was time to face the reality that he couldn't escape the family he had been born into. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could still make his own mark. It wasn't too late to decide what that would look like. The sound of the intercom broke his reverie. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now approaching New York. Please prepare for landing." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. This trip to New York wasn't just a break from the usual. It was the beginning of something new, something he couldn't quite define yet, but something that was calling to him. And maybe, just maybe, it had something to do with a chance encounter he'd never expected. As the plane began its descent toward New York, Marcus couldn't shake the lingering sense of frustration that had built throughout the day. The cramped, buzzing cabin seemed to echo his feelings, as though the confined space of the plane mirrored the confines of his life. Jeremiah Johnson's son. That's who he was to most people. It didn't matter what Marcus did, or how much he strived for something more than the business empire. The world saw him as nothing more than a product of his father's success. He shook his head, trying to push away the familiar sense of helplessness. He had been determined to get away from it all, but it seemed that wherever he went, his past followed. The memory of Jessica, the flight attendant who had dismissed him so effortlessly, lingered in his mind. Had he really let it bother him that much? He knew better than to get caught up in something so trivial, but a part of him felt insulted, not because of the mix-up in seating, but because of how she had treated him. Her lack of recognition, the simple act of seeing him as just another passenger, stung more than he cared to admit. As the plane touched down with a soft jolt, the tension in Marcus's shoulders eased slightly. This wasn't the time to dwell on such things. He had come here for a reason, and it wasn't to lose himself in petty annoyances. The business meeting his father had insisted on would begin soon enough. He had one mission for the next 48 hours, to survive the relentless expectations and return with a renewed sense of purpose. But as he exited the plane and made his way down the jet bridge toward the terminal, he felt a shift in the air. The people around him, hurrying to collect their luggage or shuffle off to the next gate, were all moving in their own worlds. Yet for some reason, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of being watched. It wasn't a feeling he often experienced, he was used to the anonymity his wealth provided. But now, it felt as though someone was observing him closely. Turning the corner into the terminal, his eyes met a pair of familiar ones. Jessica. She was standing by the baggage claim, holding a clipboard as she spoke with another attendant. Marcus didn't know why it caught him off guard, but there she was, wearing that same crisp uniform. She was just another part of the system, another employee following the rules, but something about seeing her again felt different. He wasn't sure if it was the way she seemed so absorbed in her duties or the strange sense of unfinished business between them. For a moment, Marcus considered walking past without acknowledging her, but something compelled him to stop. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a little sharper than he intended. Jessica looked up, and there was a brief flicker of recognition in her eyes. For a second, Marcus thought he saw an apology in her gaze, but it quickly disappeared behind her professional composure. "Yes, sir. How may I assist you?" she asked, her tone still polite, though the slightest hint of hesitation colored her words. Marcus forced himself to calm down. This wasn't the time to continue an argument about first-class seating. "I'm Marcus Johnson," he said, keeping his tone neutral, though he couldn't help the edge in his voice. "I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding, but I was hoping to resolve it." Jessica blinked, and for the first time since their earlier interaction, Marcus saw something resembling doubt flicker across her face. "Of course," she said, her voice softening just a touch. I wasn't aware. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." It was a simple apology, but it still didn't sit right with Marcus. He had expected her to recognize him, to understand who he was the moment he said his name, but the fact that she didn't, and the fact that she seemed so detached from any sense of respect for his position, stirred something deep inside him. This wasn't just about first-class seating. This was about his place in the world, his identity. Who was he, really? Did people see him as more than a name, more than a title, more than the son of a man who owned a global airline? There was a moment of silence as they both stood there, and Marcus suddenly felt very tired. He wanted to be angry, to demand that she understand. But something told him this wasn't the right time for that. He had more important things to focus on than a misunderstanding with a flight attendant. "Forget it," Marcus said, shaking his head and giving a small, almost reluctant smile. "I'm just here for the meeting. It's all good." Jessica blinked again, clearly taken aback by his sudden shift in demeanor. "I really am sorry, sir," she repeated. "I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." "Don't worry about it," Marcus replied, his tone now calm. "We're good." He turned to walk away, feeling the weight of the moment linger in the air behind him. It wasn't the apology he had wanted, but maybe it was the one he needed. As Marcus made his way out of the terminal and into the cool evening air of New York, he was struck by a thought: maybe Jessica had no idea who he was, and maybe that was okay. She had seen him as just another passenger, just another person. And maybe, just maybe, that's what he needed. Maybe it was time for him to step away from the identity his father had crafted for him and live as someone other than the heir to Skyline Airlines. But the more he considered it, the more he realized the conflict was far from over. The meeting tomorrow would be a reminder of everything he was trying to escape. The responsibility, the expectations, the legacy. He was a man on the edge, trying to figure out what was real and what was merely a reflection of a life he never chose. As he stepped into a waiting cab, his thoughts still drifting between his family's legacy and his own desires, he couldn't help but wonder, could he ever truly step away from the shadow of his name? Would it be enough to forge his own path, or would he always be defined by the legacy that was already written for him? The journey ahead wasn't just about the meeting, it wasn't just about a flight to New York, it was about what came next. And that was a question Marcus wasn't sure he had the answer to yet. But with every step he took, he was one step closer to figuring it out. And whatever that answer turned out to be, he knew it would change everything. Marcus sat in the back of the cab, his thoughts still racing. The night air was crisp as they navigated through the streets of Manhattan, the skyline shimmering against the darkening sky. He knew the meeting ahead would shape his future, but the tension in his chest was undeniable. As the car pulled up to the towering glass building that housed Skyline Airlines' New York headquarters, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. The skyscraper loomed over him like a massive monolith, a symbol of everything he both admired and resented about his family's empire. His father's empire. It was one thing to run a business, but it was entirely another to inherit it. To carry the weight of an entire legacy. Marcus knew that his father's plans for him had always been clear, he was the heir to the throne. No questions. No exceptions. But what if he didn't want to sit in that chair? The building's lobby was everything Marcus expected, sleek, polished, and filled with high-powered executives coming and going. His father's influence was everywhere in the space, even in the quiet hum of air conditioners and the soft ticking of clocks. Every inch of the place spoke of wealth and power. But it also spoke of control. And Marcus was no longer sure if he wanted to be a part of that narrative. He took a deep breath as he approached the elevators. The polished glass doors slid open, and he stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor. The elevator rose smoothly, but the increasing pressure in Marcus's chest was anything but smooth. His mind replayed the last few hours, the brief exchange with Jessica, the frustration of being reduced to nothing more than a title, and the deep-rooted conflict that had followed him his whole life. The elevator stopped, and the doors opened with a soft chime. Marcus stepped out into the familiar sterile hallway, the same hallway where he had walked as a young boy, trailing behind his father, trying to stay out of the way. The only difference now was the heavy sense of anticipation weighing on him. His father had called him in for a reason, and it wasn't to simply catch up over coffee. He made his way to the conference room, where the familiar faces of executives and board members waited. Marcus, his father's booming voice cut through the silence as he stood up from the head of the table. His presence filled the room as it always did, larger than life. "Dad," Marcus replied, his voice steady but laced with the uncertainty he still couldn't fully shake. He shook his father's hand, and for a moment, his gaze lingered on the sharp lines of Jeremiah's face, lines etched not just by age, but by years of decisions that had shaped the world around him. "You're late," his father remarked, but it was clear that the comment was more about the principle of the matter than any real concern. "Sorry, I was delayed at the airport," Marcus said, a hint of deflection in his tone. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, waiting for the same presence his father commanded, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to give it. He didn't want to fall into the same role that everyone else expected him to fill. "Sit, Marcus. We've got a lot to discuss," his father ordered, motioning to the seat next to him at the head of the table. The seat that had been waiting for him for years. Marcus hesitated, but then he did as his father instructed. As he sat down, the weight of the moment seemed to fall upon his shoulders. Everyone in the room watched him closely, eyes sharp and calculating. They were all here for one thing, the future of Skyline Airlines. "Let's get down to business," Jeremiah said, motioning to the first slide on the screen that appeared above the conference table. "We need to talk about the company's next steps. You've seen the numbers. We're on track for another profitable quarter, but the market's becoming more competitive. It's time to expand. And Marcus, he said, turning to his son, I need you to take the lead on this. You've been groomed for this position your entire life. Marcus' heart skipped a beat. There it was. The moment he had been dreading. His father was pushing him forward, expecting him to step into the role of CEO, to take over the reins of the airline. And it was clear from the tone in his father's voice that there was no room for debate. But Marcus wasn't ready. Not like this. Not when he didn't even know what he wanted anymore. Dad, Marcus started, but his father interrupted him. Don't start with that. I've been patient with you, Marcus. But it's time. The board is already behind you, the stakeholders are waiting, and we need someone who can take this company into the next phase. You're my son. This is your responsibility. Jeremiah's eyes bore into him, the expectation clear. The room grew quiet, and all eyes shifted to Marcus, waiting for his response. His father's words stung, the weight of the legacy bearing down on him more than ever. But there was something else lurking inside Marcus, something that had been building for a long time. A feeling he had been suppressing for years, pushed to the background by his father's voice and the unrelenting demands of the family business. But right now, sitting at that table, Marcus couldn't ignore it any longer. I don't know if I can do this, Dad, Marcus finally said, his voice breaking the silence. The words hung in the air, more raw than he expected them to be. I don't know if I want to. Jeremiah's expression faltered for just a moment, before he regained his composure. What do you mean, you don't want to? This is your birthright. You've been trained for this. There's no question about it. Marcus shook his head. I don't want to be tied to this legacy if it means losing who I am in the process. I need to find my own way, not just follow the path you've laid out for me. For a moment, the room was still. Jeremiah's face hardened, and the other executives exchanged uneasy glances. You can't just walk away from this, Marcus, his father said, his voice growing sharper. You think the world is going to just let you go? The company needs you. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't back down. Maybe it needs me, but it doesn't need me to be something I'm not. I've spent my life living up to your expectations, and it's time I started figuring out who I am outside of all this. I don't know what that means yet, but I can't keep pretending that this is what I want. The silence in the room felt suffocating. The tension was palpable. Jeremiah's jaw clenched as he stood up, his gaze never leaving his son. Think long and hard about what you're saying, Marcus, he said, his voice cold. The opportunity of a lifetime doesn't come around every day. Marcus stood as well, his resolve stronger than ever. I know, Dad. But the opportunity to live my own life does. And I'm going to take it. With that, Marcus turned and walked out of the room, leaving his father and the board members in stunned silence. The weight of the decision he had just made settled heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time in his life, he felt a flicker of freedom. It wasn't over. But it was a step. And it was his. Marcus stepped out of the towering building and into the biting cold of New York's winter evening. His father's words still echoed in his mind, but he pushed them away, choosing to focus on the steady rhythm of his steps on the sidewalk. The city bustled around him, cars honking, people talking, but in that moment, it felt like everything was quiet, like he was in a world of his own. He had just done the unthinkable, he had told his father no. In the middle of a room full of powerful people, Marcus had made the boldest decision of his life. And yet, as the weight of the decision began to settle in, a strange sense of both relief and fear flooded through him. He had expected to feel liberated, to feel free. But what he felt instead was the slow burn of regret, mixed with a touch of exhilaration. Was this what freedom really felt like? Or had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? Marcus didn't know where to go. His feet seemed to carry him aimlessly through the city, taking him down streets he didn't recognize, into alleyways lit only by the faint glow of neon signs. He needed to clear his head, to make sense of what had just happened. The decision to walk away from the company, from his father's expectations, had been years in the making. But today, standing in that cold city, he was finally facing the reality of what it meant. His entire identity had been wrapped up in the family business for so long. And now, it felt like he was losing everything he had ever known. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a message from his mother: "We need to talk. Call me when you get a chance." Marcus's heart sank. He knew this conversation was inevitable. His mother had always been the more understanding one, the one who saw the complexity of his feelings. But even she couldn't ignore the consequences of his decision. She was married to his father, after all. She understood the stakes. With a sigh, Marcus dialed her number and waited as it rang. "Marcus," his mother's voice came through the phone, warm and concerned. "Are you okay?" "I don't know, Mom," Marcus admitted, his voice a little shaky. "I don't know if I made the right choice." "Sweetheart, I'm sure you had a reason for what you did. But your father, he's devastated. You know how much the airline means to him. It's his life. It's everything he's built. And I can't pretend that what you did didn't hurt him." "I didn't mean to hurt him," Marcus said quietly. "But I'm not sure I can live my life under that shadow anymore. I've been trying to figure out who I am for so long. I thought that if I took over, it would all make sense. But it doesn't. It's not enough." His mother was silent for a moment. "You've always been more than the company, Marcus. I know that. But sometimes the weight of everything can cloud your judgment. Maybe you need time to figure out what you want. Just don't make any rash decisions without thinking it through. This is big. It's not just your life at stake here." Marcus clenched his jaw, his breath coming out in sharp bursts. "I know. But I can't keep pretending. I've spent my whole life living for other people, living for my father's dream. I need to know who I am, outside of all of this." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when his mother spoke again, her voice was softer. "I understand, Marcus. I do. But you're not alone in this. Just remember, sometimes finding yourself means stepping away from everything you thought you knew." "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself for what I did to him," Marcus admitted, his voice cracking. "But I don't want to lose myself anymore, either." "You won't," she reassured him. "But just know that there will be consequences. And you'll need to face them, whether you're ready or not." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay ahead. But in that moment, as the lights of the city twinkled around him, he felt something shift inside of him, a small, fragile feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had taken the first step toward discovering who he was meant to be. He ended the call with his mother and stood there for a long time, staring up at the skyline. The city stretched out before him, a maze of possibilities and decisions, each one leading him further away from the life he knew. He had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, he was finally free to find out. The next morning, Marcus woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing once again. This time, it was an email from his father's assistant, confirming a meeting with the board later that day. It was a professional formality, nothing too surprising. But what caught Marcus off guard was the subject line: "Urgent, family discussion." He didn't need to open the email to know what it meant. His father wasn't going to let this go easily. There would be consequences. But what kind of consequences? Marcus stared at the screen for a long moment, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He had made his decision, but now he had to face the fallout. There would be no turning back, no running away from the responsibility he had just rejected. But in the depths of his uncertainty, Marcus couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that this was the beginning of something new, something he had never allowed himself to imagine. His life was his own now. He could do whatever he wanted. And for the first time, that was enough. The air inside the boardroom was thick with tension. The long, sleek table stretched out before Marcus, surrounded by stern, calculating faces that reflected everything he had come to expect from the high-powered world of Skyline Airlines. The polished wood gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but the sharp gaze of every board member around him cut deeper than any glare. His father stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, an air of authority that could crush anyone in its path. Marcus took a seat, the weight of the moment pressing down on him as he tried to steady his breathing. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this, a boardroom full of people staring him down, was definitely not it. His father's unspoken command filled the room, and Marcus could feel the stir of discomfort creeping up his spine. But he wasn't backing down. "You asked for this meeting," his father said, his voice booming across the room. The words weren't a question, they were a challenge. "Now, let's get to the point, Marcus." "I didn't ask for anything," Marcus responded quietly. "I'm here because I think it's time for a change." His father's eyebrows raised in disbelief. "A change? After everything we've built, you think now is the time for change? This company, this airline, it's not just a business, it's a legacy." "Your legacy." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside him. "It's not my legacy, Dad. It's yours. I'm not ready to take it on. Not the way you want me to." The room fell into an awkward silence. He could feel the board members' eyes narrowing on him, their murmurs turning into sharp whispers. It wasn't just his father who was angry, it was the entire board, the people who controlled the flow of money and power within Skyline Airlines. They weren't pleased by his sudden refusal, and they certainly weren't shy about showing it. "You think this is just about you?" one of the senior board members, Mr. Lambert, spoke up. He was an older man with graying hair, wearing a sharp suit that seemed to be designed to intimidate. "We've invested decades of our lives into this company. This is bigger than your feelings, Marcus. This affects thousands of families, millions of customers, and, most importantly, our stockholders." "Exactly," another board member, Ms. Davis, chimed in. "This is a business. A well-oiled machine. It's not some hobby you can just walk away from because you have doubts about your place in it. We don't have the luxury of finding ourselves at the expense of everything else." Marcus felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. They were right in some ways. Skyline wasn't just a company, it was a pillar of the economy, a global presence. But what they didn't understand was that to him, it wasn't just about the business. It was about control. Power. The expectation to be something he wasn't, something he never chose to be. "I'm not walking away from everything," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside. "I'm asking for a break. I need time to figure out if I'm really the person you want leading this company." His father's gaze hardened. "You think I haven't given you time," he said, voice low and laced with frustration. "You've been in the background for years, and now when it's time to step up, you choose to run away from your responsibilities. You disappoint me, Marcus." The sting of those words hit harder than Marcus was prepared for. He had always been in his father's shadow, trying to measure up, trying to be what his father had always envisioned. But now, for the first time, he saw it for what it truly was, a trap. He stood up from his chair, unable to sit still any longer. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Maybe I have been in the background. But that's because I never wanted to lead this company the way you did. I didn't choose this life, Dad. I didn't ask for this burden." The board members exchanged looks, murmuring amongst themselves. His father, however, remained silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his tone quieter but no less forceful. "You want a break? Fine," his father said. "But don't think for one second that you can just waltz back in here when you've figured out whatever it is you're searching for. This company, Marcus, it's more than just your playground for self-discovery. It's the legacy I've worked my entire life to build, and I will not let you destroy it because of some temporary doubts." Marcus clenched his fists, feeling the weight of his father's words like a physical blow. But something inside of him was stirring, a deep, quiet certainty that he was doing the right thing. He couldn't go back to being what everyone else wanted him to be. He had to find his own path. "I'm not destroying anything," Marcus said, his voice firm. "But I can't be the person you want me to be. Not anymore." His father looked at him, a flicker of something, perhaps disappointment, perhaps anger, flashing in his eyes. But then, to Marcus's surprise, his father simply nodded. "Then leave," he said, his voice cold. "You'll never be CEO of Skyline, Marcus. And if that's what you want, you can walk away from everything today. Just don't expect me to support you anymore. You make your own choices from here on out." Marcus stood there for a moment, the weight of his father's words sinking in. This was it. There was no going back. With a slow, deliberate motion, Marcus turned and walked out of the boardroom. As he made his way down the hallway, the conversations inside the room continued, but he could no longer hear them. His mind was too loud, his thoughts spinning in every direction. He wasn't sure what his next steps would be, but one thing was certain: he had taken control of his life, for better or worse. As he stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, Marcus felt the first real sense of clarity he had in a long time. For the first time, he was standing on his own, with no legacy to carry, no expectations to live up to. It was terrifying. But it was also liberating. He had no idea where this would lead him, but one thing was for sure: he wasn't going to let anyone, not even his father, define his path any longer. Marcus stood at the edge of the city, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets as he watched the skyline fade into the distance. The world around him felt like a blur, a cacophony of busy streets, honking taxis, and rushing pedestrians. But Marcus felt disconnected from it all. He was in the city he had called home his whole life, and yet, for the first time, it felt alien to him. The weight of his father's rejection still hung heavy on his shoulders, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had shifted in him, something he couldn't take back. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out to see a text message from his mother: "I think it's time we talk, Marcus. Come by the house when you get a chance. We need to figure this out." The words felt like a weight pressing down on him. He knew the conversation was coming. His mother, ever the mediator between him and his father, had always been the one to smooth over the tensions. But this was different. He had defied his father's will in the most public way possible. The board knew. The world knew. And now, his mother would have to pick a side. With a heavy sigh, Marcus typed back a quick reply: "I'll be there soon." As he walked through the streets of the city, his mind spun with conflicting emotions. He was angry, hurt, and above all, confused. He had taken a stand, made a bold decision, but at what cost? He had just turned his back on everything his father had worked for, everything he had been raised to believe in. And for what? To find himself? To discover who he really was? But what if that was all an illusion? What if, in the end, there was nothing waiting for him but more pain, more empty choices? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the streets, Marcus made his way to his mother's house. He could see the lights shining through the windows as he approached the front door, and for a moment, he felt a pang of nostalgia for the home he had left behind. But when he stepped inside, the warmth of the house didn't comfort him as it once had. His mother was sitting at the kitchen table, her face drawn with worry. She didn't look up when he entered. Instead, she stared at her hands, her fingers nervously twisting a napkin between them. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice strained, "I didn't expect you to make a decision like this." He sat down across from her, unsure of how to begin. He didn't have the answers she was looking for, and he didn't know if he could even explain why he had done it. But the words spilled out before he could stop them. "I couldn't do it anymore, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was suffocating under the weight of it all." I've spent my whole life living for Dad's dream, for his company. And I just couldn't keep pretending that it was mine. I had to step away. His mother sighed, her eyes never leaving her hands. I understand, Marcus. I really do. But this isn't just about you. You know that, right? This affects your father, your whole family. This company is the only thing he has left now. It's everything to him. Marcus felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest, but he pushed it down. I know it means everything to him. But it doesn't mean anything to me. Not the way it should. I don't want to choose sides, she said, finally looking up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and concern. But I have to tell you, Marcus, this has torn your father apart. He's not the man you think he is. He's been working his whole life for this company, and now you've taken it away from him. I didn't take anything from him, Marcus said, his voice rising in frustration. I'm not trying to destroy his company. But I can't keep living his dream. I have to figure out what I want, who I am outside of this legacy. She shook her head. You think you can just walk away from everything, Marcus? From the family, from your father, from the company? You think you can just step outside of this and figure it all out? That's not how it works. The world doesn't wait for you to find yourself. The world moves on, with or without you. He felt the sting of her words, but deep down, he knew she was right. He was no longer just fighting for his own freedom, he was up against a world that would not wait for him to figure things out. The pressure to succeed, to live up to the legacy his father had created, wasn't just something he could shed like an old coat. It was a part of him, whether he wanted it to be or not. Do you think you'll be happy? She asked quietly, her voice softer now. Do you think stepping away from everything will make you feel better? Because I'm afraid you'll regret it. I don't know, Mom, Marcus admitted, his voice cracking with uncertainty. I don't know if I'll ever be happy. But I know I'll never find peace unless I try. I have to try. His mother sighed, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. Just promise me one thing, Marcus. Don't let this bitterness take over. Don't let your anger at your father cloud your judgment. You've always been better than that. I'll try, he said, though he wasn't sure he believed the words. But he couldn't give up now. He had made his choice. And even if it meant losing everything, he had to see it through. His mother didn't say anything more, but the silence between them spoke volumes. As he stood up to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same. The rift between him and his father had deepened. And the future was uncertain, dark, and full of questions. But there was one thing Marcus knew for sure, he was going to find his own way, no matter the cost. Marcus's footsteps echoed in the empty streets as he made his way to a small coffee shop nestled between a bookstore and a gallery. The city around him hummed with the rhythm of daily life, but he felt like an outsider, moving through it without truly belonging. His phone had buzzed again, another message from his father. He had left it unread, unsure if he was ready to face him, or if he ever would be. He needed space. Time. The door of the coffee shop chimed softly as Marcus entered, and the warm scent of espresso hit him immediately, calming his nerves. It was a quiet place, tucked away from the chaos of the city, a place where people came to escape and reflect. He had always loved spots like this, places that felt like they could shelter you from the outside world, if only for a little while. The barista behind the counter gave him a warm smile as he walked up to order. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice friendly and welcoming. "Just a black coffee," Marcus replied, his mind still swirling with thoughts of his father, his mother, and everything he had just left behind. As he waited for his coffee, his eyes drifted to a table by the window, where a man sat, hunched over a laptop, scribbling notes on a notepad. There was something familiar about him, though Marcus couldn't quite place it. The man was lost in his work, his brow furrowed in concentration. As the barista handed him his drink, Marcus hesitated, then decided to sit at the nearby table. He could use a moment of quiet, maybe some fresh air and time to think things over. He sat down, staring out the window as the city moved around him. The weight of his decision from the night before was still heavy, and yet, there was a strange sense of calm beginning to settle in. He had walked away. He had defied the expectations placed upon him. But now what? What was the next step? Mind if I join you? The voice broke through his thoughts, and Marcus turned to see the man from the window, standing with his coffee in hand. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a scruffy beard and a calm, collected demeanor. He wore a well-worn leather jacket, the kind that made him look like he had stories to tell. Marcus could sense that this wasn't just a random encounter, it felt more like fate. "Sure," Marcus said, gesturing to the empty seat. "I don't mind." The man set down his cup and sat across from him, smiling in a way that felt surprisingly genuine. "I'm Ben," he said, offering his hand. "Marcus," he replied, shaking his hand. "So, what's got you in deep thought on a Wednesday afternoon?" Ben asked, his voice casual but with an edge of curiosity. Marcus hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He wasn't used to talking about his problems with strangers, but something about Ben's presence felt different. It didn't feel like an intrusion, just a genuine attempt to understand. "I'm not sure what I'm doing with my life," Marcus admitted, his words coming out before he could stop them. "I've spent my whole life following in my father's footsteps, and now I've just walked away. But now I don't know what comes next. Everything I thought I was meant to do, it feels like it doesn't matter anymore." Ben nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "I get that," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Sometimes we spend so much time chasing other people's dreams that we forget to figure out what we really want. But that doesn't mean you've lost your way, it just means you're taking a detour." Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A detour? That sounds like something a motivational speaker would say." Ben chuckled. "Maybe. But it's true. Life isn't a straight path. Sometimes you have to take a few detours to find the right road. And it's okay to not have all the answers right now." "I guess I never thought of it that way," Marcus said, feeling a spark of understanding. "It's just hard, you know. My whole life has been planned out for me. The company. The legacy. The expectations. And now that I'm free of it, I don't even know where to start." Ben's expression softened, his eyes reflecting a sense of understanding. "It's scary, man. When everything you've known is suddenly taken away, it's like standing at the edge of a cliff. But sometimes, the scariest part is jumping off." Marcus sat back in his chair, digesting his words. "It feels like jumping into the unknown, but that might be exactly what I need." Ben smiled knowingly. "You've already made a big jump. The hardest part is over. Now you just have to trust that you'll land on your feet." Marcus couldn't help but let out a laugh, despite the heaviness of his situation. "I hope you're right." There was a pause as Ben took another sip of his coffee, clearly thinking. "You know, Marcus, sometimes when we feel like we've lost everything, we actually haven't. We just need to look around and realize what we still have. Maybe you need to find something that actually excites you, something that's not tied to your family or that company. Have you ever considered just trying something completely different?" Marcus thought about it for a moment. "Like what?" Ben leaned in slightly, his voice lowering to a more conspiratorial tone. "What if you started over? Travel. Explore. Get your hands dirty in something new. You could work remotely, take a job in a completely different industry, something that isn't tied to your past. You know, start over from scratch." Marcus mulled it over, the idea settling into his mind. Travel. Escape. A chance to truly discover who he was without the baggage of his family's expectations. It was a radical thought, one that he hadn't even considered in the whirlwind of the past few days. "Maybe I need a change of scenery," Marcus said quietly, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. I've spent so much time in the same place, doing the same things. Maybe it's time to break free completely. Ben grinned. There you go. Sometimes the hardest part is just making the decision to let go. After that, the rest will fall into place. Marcus felt a sense of clarity begin to form, something he hadn't felt in days. Maybe he didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the verge of something new. Thanks, Ben, Marcus said, genuinely grateful for the conversation. I think you've just given me something to think about. Ben nodded, his expression light and encouraging. Anytime, man. You've got this. As Marcus left the coffee shop, he felt a sense of hope stirring inside him. The future still felt uncertain, but the road ahead didn't seem as daunting. Maybe, just maybe, the detour was exactly what he needed. The next few days passed in a blur for Marcus. It wasn't that he wasn't thinking, far from it. But the decision to step away from his father's company, the legacy that had defined him for so long, still weighed heavily on him. He knew he couldn't just run away from everything. He had to confront the choice he had made, for better or worse. But something Ben had said kept echoing in his mind, sometimes, the hardest part is just making the decision to let go. And Marcus had done that. He had made the decision. Now it was time to figure out what came next. He had spent years living in a world where everything was planned, where every move was calculated. Now, for the first time, he had nothing but space and possibility ahead of him. It was both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a vast, unknown ocean. On a cold morning, Marcus stood in front of his apartment's window, staring out at the city below. The city he'd once known so well now felt like a distant memory, something that no longer held any of the answers he was searching for. His phone sat on the kitchen counter, silent. No messages from his father, no reminders from his mother. He was completely alone. But rather than feeling overwhelmed by that isolation, Marcus felt the tiniest spark of freedom. There was no one telling him where to go, what to do, or what his life should look like. There was only the wide-open world in front of him, and it was time for him to take his first step into it. He had a list of things he wanted to do, though it was far from structured. No timeline, no deadlines, just a sense of curiosity. He wanted to travel, but he didn't know where. He wanted to explore new careers, but he wasn't sure what direction that would take him. He wanted to find purpose, but the idea of finding it right now seemed almost laughable. Purpose was something he'd always been told was already waiting for him, written in the success of his father's business. But now he had to create his own, and that was a much more difficult task than he had imagined. In the end, it all boiled down to one thing, taking action. Marcus could no longer sit idly by, waiting for the answers to come to him. The first step needed to be taken, even if it was uncertain. His phone buzzed again, and this time, he grabbed it. It was a message from an old college friend, Jessica. She had reached out a few times over the years, but their lives had drifted in different directions. The message was simple but intriguing. Hey, Marcus. I remember you always talking about wanting to explore the world. Well, I just landed a job with a travel company. How do you feel about working remotely and getting paid to explore? Let me know if you're interested. Marcus stared at the message for a long time, a sense of excitement rising in his chest. This was the type of opportunity he had been dreaming about but never believed would come. He tapped out a quick response, "What do I need to do?" Jessica's reply came quickly, "Let's talk soon. I think you'd be perfect for it." The idea of working remotely, traveling while still earning money, was everything Marcus had envisioned in his brief moments of clarity. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it felt like a way to get his feet wet, to experience life outside the narrow confines of his family's expectations. He could go to new places, meet new people, and maybe even figure out what it was that truly excited him. But even as he typed the message back, a small part of him felt hesitant. He'd always been a planner, someone who followed a clear path. This was different. This was stepping into the unknown, where the only plan was the one he made along the way. The idea of working remotely appealed to Marcus for another reason: it offered the freedom to move at his own pace. He could explore, but he didn't have to rush into something drastic. It was the kind of transition he needed, one step at a time, without pressure. Within a few days, he had secured the job, and he found himself packing a suitcase filled with nothing but essentials. A flight to an unfamiliar place was booked, an adventure in the making, a trip that would take him to Costa Rica to start his new remote job. He wasn't sure what would happen when he got there, but he knew he had to go. The world was bigger than his father's company, and it was time for him to see it. As Marcus sat on the plane, staring out the window at the vast expanse of the sky, he thought about everything he had left behind. The tension with his father. The guilt over the company. The expectations that had hung over him like a cloud for as long as he could remember. But in this moment, none of that mattered. It wasn't about the legacy anymore. It wasn't about what he had to do to live up to someone else's vision. This was about his own journey, his own discovery. And even if he didn't know where it would lead, Marcus felt more alive than he had in years. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Marcus let out a deep breath, the kind that felt like he was finally letting go of the weight he had carried for so long. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he didn't need them. His journey had begun. The first thing Marcus noticed when he landed in Costa Rica was the warmth. The air was thick with humidity, but in a way that felt refreshing, like it was giving his body permission to relax after years of tension. He stepped off the plane and felt the heat immediately, a stark contrast to the cold, artificial air conditioning of the office buildings and his sterile apartment back home. The airport was small but bustling, full of people speaking in rapid Spanish, a language he barely understood. Still, it was a reminder that he was no longer in the world he knew, and that realization filled him with a strange sense of freedom. He had booked a simple hotel for the first few nights, a quaint spot near the coast, close enough to the beach to catch a glimpse of the Pacific Ocean. As he navigated his way through the airport, his nerves gave way to excitement. Everything felt new. Everything felt alive. For once, there was no pressure, no legacy weighing him down, no phone calls from his father demanding his next move. This was his time. At the hotel, the receptionist greeted him with a smile, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, her skin tanned from the sun. "Bienvenidos a Costa Rica," she said warmly, offering him a small map of the area and a brochure with a list of local tours. Marcus smiled back, taking the map. He had no real plans beyond getting settled, but as he looked down at the map, he realized how many places there were to explore. Waterfalls, volcanoes, national parks, and remote beaches. The possibilities were endless. He didn't need to make any decisions right away. For the first time in years, he didn't have to decide what came next. He could let the world unfold in front of him, step by step, without the crushing weight of expectations guiding him every moment. The hotel room was simple, with whitewashed walls and wooden furniture that smelled faintly of pine. It was small but cozy, with a view of the jungle outside. Marcus dropped his suitcase on the bed and went to the window. The sight before him was breathtaking, lush green trees, birds soaring in the sky, and the distant sound of the ocean waves. It was hard to believe this was his reality now. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a sense of peace. He had left behind a life that had been mapped out for him, and now he was free to create his own path, even if he wasn't exactly sure where it would lead. That evening, he went to the beach. The sky had turned a deep orange as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sand. The ocean, calm and inviting, stretched out endlessly before him. He took off his shoes, feeling the warm sand beneath his feet, and let the waves lap at his toes. It felt like the world was wide open, like he was standing on the edge of something huge. The feeling was overwhelming, but in a good way. There were no deadlines, no expectations, just the sound of the waves and the distant calls of seagulls. It was liberating, and he breathed deeply, soaking in the serenity of the moment. As he walked along the shore, Marcus thought about what Ben had said, that sometimes, you just had to jump. The hardest part wasn't the jump itself, it was having the courage to take the first step. And Marcus had done that. He had taken the leap, and now, here he was, standing in a foreign country, with nothing but the future ahead of him. But that thought was fleeting. For now, all he wanted to do was enjoy the present, the beautiful sunset, the cool breeze, the sand beneath his feet. The next few days passed in a blur of exploration. Marcus visited nearby villages, tasted local food, and even went on a guided tour of a nearby rainforest. Each new experience left him feeling more alive than he had in a long time. He could hardly believe how much he had been missing, how much he had closed himself off to during the years he had spent chasing the corporate ladder. It wasn't just about the job, either. It was about the people he met, the stories they shared, the way they lived so freely, without the burden of trying to meet someone else's expectations. He was seeing a different way of life, and it was refreshing. His new job was simple enough, a remote position that involved working with clients around the world. The work itself wasn't particularly exciting, but it was enough to keep him busy. More than anything, it gave him the financial freedom to continue his travels and take his time figuring out what he really wanted to do. Each morning, he would sit in a small cafe with a coffee in hand, watching the world go by. The locals, many of whom spoke little English, would greet him with smiles and waves, treating him like part of the community. It was such a contrast to his life back home, where interactions often felt transactional, brief, and impersonal. Here, everything felt more laid back, more personal. One afternoon, as he sat on the cafe's balcony, laptop open and coffee at his side, Marcus received a message from his father. It was brief, and it took him a few moments to process the words. "We need to talk. I'm coming to Costa Rica." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this, not after everything that had happened. His first instinct was to delete the message, to ignore it entirely. He didn't need this right now. But the message lingered in his mind. Maybe he was running from his father, from the weight of family expectations, but the reality was that his father had built this empire with his own two hands. And as much as Marcus had tried to distance himself from it, a part of him still felt responsible for the legacy he was leaving behind. He had come to Costa Rica to find himself, to figure out what he wanted to do. But part of him knew that this wasn't over. His father would come. And Marcus would have to face the consequences of his decision. But for now, he closed his laptop, took a deep breath, and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The message from his father lingered in Marcus's mind all night. He tried to focus on the peacefulness of Costa Rica, the rhythm of the ocean waves crashing against the shore, the warm breeze rustling the palm trees, but the thought of his father's impending arrival gnawed at him. For so many years, Marcus had been trying to escape the weight of his father's expectations, and yet, here he was, on the other side of the world, only to be confronted by the same looming presence. His phone buzzed the next morning, and he picked it up without thinking. It was from Ben. "How's the adventure going? Any plans for today?" Marcus paused before responding. It felt good to hear from Ben. He was one of the few people Marcus had let into his life who hadn't tried to direct him toward any specific goal. Ben had always been supportive, always encouraging Marcus to follow his own path. Marcus replied, "It's going well. Lots of exploring, getting to know the place. But, I got a message from my dad. He's coming to Costa Rica." Ben's response came quickly, "Whoa, that's unexpected. Are you ready for that?" Marcus didn't know how to answer that question. He wasn't sure if he was ever going to be ready to confront his father, especially not after everything that had happened. The tension, the unresolved feelings, it all felt like a knot in his chest. I'm not sure. But I'm here, and I have to deal with it sooner or later. Ben's reply was short, but reassuring. Whatever happens, I know you've got this. You're not alone in it. Marcus put the phone down and stared out the window at the clear blue sky. The ocean shimmered in the distance, and the streets below bustled with life, locals moving quickly, tourists taking in the sights. He should have been grateful for the serenity, but instead, his mind raced with thoughts of his father's arrival. The next few hours passed in a blur. Marcus tried to focus on his work, but his concentration was shot. The task at hand seemed trivial compared to the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Would his father try to convince him to return to the family business? Would he guilt-trip him into taking the reins of the company? Would this trip be another attempt to fix Marcus, to make him into the person his father believed he should be? Eventually, Marcus found himself pacing around the room, his mind spinning. He couldn't help but feel a sense of dread about the meeting, and yet, a small part of him also felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the chance he needed to truly understand where he stood with his father, to hear him out, to clear the air, and perhaps to take one step closer to understanding why they had been so distant for so long. By mid-afternoon, Marcus received a call from the hotel's front desk. His father had arrived and was waiting for him in the lobby. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He stood in front of the mirror, fixing his shirt, running his hands through his hair. It was absurd, but he wanted to look presentable, even though part of him wished he didn't care about appearances at all. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like the longest of his life. The doors opened, and there stood his father, tall, imposing, his salt and pepper hair combed neatly, his sharp suit as pristine as ever. Marcus, his father said, his voice smooth but carrying the weight of authority. It's good to see you. Marcus nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, you too. Didn't expect to see you here. His father studied him for a moment, as if taking in his son's appearance, the casual clothes, the relaxed demeanor. It was clear that Marcus wasn't the same person who had left the family business all those months ago. I know this is unexpected, his father said, his tone almost apologetic, though Marcus could detect the familiar edge beneath it. But we need to talk. We need to resolve this, for the sake of the company in our future. The words felt like a punch to the stomach. The company and our future. Always about the company, always about the legacy. Marcus crossed his arms, taking a deep breath. I'm not here for the business. I'm here for myself. His father's eyebrows furrowed slightly, a rare crack in his usually composed exterior. I understand that you've chosen a different path. But you can't simply walk away from everything we've built. This is bigger than you, Marcus. It's bigger than both of us. Marcus swallowed, biting back the frustration that welled up inside him. You're right, it's bigger than both of us. But it's also not just yours anymore. I've spent my whole life being part of it, and I can't keep doing that when I don't have any say in it. It's not my dream anymore. It's yours. There was a long silence between them, thick with tension. Marcus watched his father's face, the lines etched from years of hard work, the cold calculation in his eyes. His father opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus held up a hand. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I just need to find my own way. For once, I need to do something that's just for me. His father's expression softened, ever so slightly. I've always wanted what's best for you. I may not have shown it in the way you wanted, but I've never stopped caring. Marcus took a step forward, the words coming out faster now, fueled by everything he had held back for years. But caring doesn't mean controlling every aspect of my life. I don't need to be the person you've imagined for me. I just need to be myself. For a long moment, his father was silent. Then, finally, he nodded. I can't promise you that things will be easy. But I'll respect your decision, Marcus. You have my word. Marcus felt the weight in his chest ease, just slightly. The knot was loosening, but it wasn't gone. He wasn't sure if this was the start of healing, but at least it was a beginning. And that, for now, was enough. I'm glad you came, Marcus said quietly, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. I just need time to figure things out. His father nodded once more. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. And for the first time, Marcus felt like his father wasn't trying to hold him back. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them to move forward, together, on their own terms. The next few days passed by in a blur of strange, almost surreal moments. Marcus and his father had agreed to spend time together, but there was no rush, no expectation of a big, life-changing conversation. They simply coexisted in the tranquil setting of Costa Rica, something Marcus hadn't anticipated would be so peaceful. They did the typical tourist activities, visiting the beaches, strolling through small towns, eating fresh seafood at local restaurants. His father had always been someone who focused on results, on achieving goals and pushing forward. But here, away from the hustle and bustle of the family business, they were just two people exploring the world, and in a way, it felt more like they were beginning to rediscover one another. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of the small hotel restaurant, overlooking the ocean, Marcus found himself feeling content. There was something about the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that softened everything, even his hardened views. The view was breathtaking, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus allowed himself to enjoy the moment. His father, sitting across from him, broke the silence. Do you remember when we used to take those trips together? Back when you were younger? Marcus looked up, surprised by the nostalgia in his father's voice. Yeah, I remember. You'd always have an itinerary, and I'd grumble about not being able to relax. His father chuckled. I guess I was always trying to make sure you didn't miss anything. Always trying to give you the best of everything. Marcus swallowed. He had never thought of it like that. I didn't always appreciate it at the time. But looking back, I get it now. You wanted the best for me. I did, his father said quietly, staring out at the ocean. But sometimes, I think I got too focused on the destination and forgot about the journey. I wanted you to inherit the business, to take it to new heights. But in doing that, I may have lost sight of what mattered most, you. The words hung in the air, and Marcus felt the tension in his chest begin to loosen just a bit. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest thing to vulnerability his father had shown in years. I know I pushed you too hard, his father continued. I wanted you to understand what I'd built, to feel the weight of it. But I never realized how much that might have crushed you. Marcus couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. This wasn't the man who had always expected perfection, the man who had demanded more from him than he'd ever given himself. This was different. I didn't know how to handle it, Marcus admitted. I didn't know how to be the person you wanted me to be. It wasn't that I didn't want to try, I just felt like I was drowning in it all. His father looked at him then, really looked at him, and there was a tenderness in his eyes that Marcus hadn't seen in years. I see that now. And I'm sorry. I've always loved you, Marcus, even if I didn't always show it the way I should have. Marcus's throat tightened. There was so much unsaid between them, so many years of silence, of missed connections, of misunderstandings. But hearing these words, it was enough to start untangling that knot inside him, the one that had been there for as long as he could remember. I'm not sure what I'm doing, Dad, Marcus said softly. I still don't know where I'm going, but I'm trying to figure it out. This place, it's different. It's peaceful. And I think I needed this. His father nodded slowly. It's hard, isn't it? To find your way when everyone expects you to follow a certain path. But it's never too late to change course. If this is what you need, then I'll support you. I may not understand it fully, but I'll support you. Marcus blinked, feeling a mix of emotions he didn't quite know how to process. It wasn't perfect, this conversation. There was no grand resolution, no magical moment of clarity. But it felt like a step forward. Just a small one, but it was something. Thanks, Dad, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. That means more than you know. The rest of the evening was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. They didn't need to say anything else. For once, they just sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sound of the ocean filling the space between them. The following day, Marcus woke early. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft pink light over the horizon. He decided to take a walk along the beach to clear his head, to process everything that had happened over the past few days. As he walked along the shoreline, he felt the weight of the decision he'd made a few days ago, the decision to leave the family business behind, to try and build something of his own. It wasn't an easy choice, but it felt right. Every step he took on the soft sand felt like progress, like he was moving closer to the person he wanted to be. He didn't know exactly what that person would look like yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. After his walk, he returned to the hotel to find his father waiting for him at the small breakfast table. Morning, his father greeted him with a smile. You've got the look of someone who's come to a decision. Marcus hesitated for a moment before replying. I think I have. I'm not going back to the family business, not now. I need to find something that's mine, something that makes me feel fulfilled, not just successful. His father regarded him quietly, his expression unreadable. I respect that. And I'll respect whatever you choose. But know this, Marcus, it doesn't matter what path you take. I'll always be here to support you. Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be challenges ahead. But he was no longer running from his past. He was learning to walk forward, one step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, he was learning to forgive himself too. The following week passed with a surprising sense of calm, one that Marcus hadn't experienced in a long time. The days blurred together as he and his father navigated their newfound understanding, each of them adjusting to the idea that the relationship between them didn't have to revolve around expectations and business pressures. Yet, as peaceful as things were becoming, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. Something inside him was calling out, urging him to take that final step, into something new, something that wasn't tied to his past or his father's shadow. One morning, as he sat on the balcony with a coffee in hand, Marcus found himself staring at the horizon, the ocean stretching out in front of him. The quiet, rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the shore seemed to speak to him, whispering promises of new opportunities and fresh starts. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Ben. How's everything? I was thinking about you and wanted to check in. Do you feel any closer to figuring things out? Marcus smiled, appreciating the simplicity of Ben's text. It was a reminder that no matter how complicated things got, there were people in his life who understood him without demanding anything from him. I think I'm getting there, Marcus typed back. There's still a lot of figuring out to do, but I'm starting to feel like I'm in the right place. Not just physically, here in Costa Rica, but mentally, too. Like I'm finally moving in the right direction. Ben's response came quickly, that's amazing. You've always been one to take risks and follow your gut. I believe in you, man. Whatever you decide to do next, you've got this. The encouragement warmed Marcus's heart. Ben had always believed in him, even when Marcus wasn't sure he believed in himself. For the first time in what felt like years, Marcus realized that he had the freedom to choose, to forge his own path. He didn't need to be tethered to a legacy that wasn't his, and he didn't need to live in the shadow of his father's dreams. He stood up and walked into the hotel room, his mind racing with possibilities. What if he could build something completely his own? What if there was a way to combine his passions with something that could make a real difference in the world? He didn't have the answers yet, but he felt something stirring inside him, a spark of creativity and drive that he hadn't felt in years. After a quick breakfast with his father, Marcus excused himself and headed to the beach for another walk. His mind was buzzing with ideas, and the cool morning air helped clear his head. He needed to explore. To take the leap into something that was entirely his own. The warm sand beneath his feet felt grounding, as if each step was a declaration of his intent. He had always been good at analyzing situations, making calculated decisions, but this felt different. It wasn't about calculation anymore, it was about instinct. About trust. About believing that the right path would unfold if he was brave enough to step into the unknown. The idea started to form in his mind, something that could bridge his love for travel, his desire to do good in the world, and his skills in business. He could create a travel company, one that focused on sustainable, eco-friendly tourism. A company that not only introduced people to beautiful destinations but also gave back to those communities in meaningful ways. It was a challenge. It would take work, hard work, but for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt excited about the future. He could already envision the brand, the partnerships with local communities, the way the company could educate travelers and make a tangible impact. His phone buzzed again, snapping him back to reality. It was a call from his father. "Marcus," his father's voice came through the speaker, "I've been thinking. If you're serious about this new direction, I'd like to help. I have some contacts who could provide the financial backing you need. We can do this together." Marcus's heart raced, but not in the way it used to. He wasn't panicking, he was considering. His father's offer wasn't about pushing him into the family business, it was about helping him with his own vision. The realization was both freeing and daunting. Was he ready to accept help from the one person who had been the source of his conflict for so long? He paused for a moment, walking along the shore as the waves lapped at his feet. Was he ready to take this chance, to step into his own future while still acknowledging the role his father could play in that future? "I appreciate the offer, Dad," Marcus said slowly. "But this is something I need to do on my own. I need to build this myself." His father was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could hear the weight of the unspoken words in the silence. Then, his father spoke. "I understand. You don't need to do it alone, but I respect that you want to carve your own path. Just know I'm here if you need me." It was the first time his father had acknowledged Marcus's independence without pushing his own agenda. And in that moment, Marcus felt a shift, one that wasn't just in his relationship with his father, but within himself. "I'll make it happen," Marcus said with newfound determination. "I'm going to build something that's mine. Something I'm proud of." After the call, Marcus walked back to the hotel, his mind clearer than it had been in weeks. He was starting to understand what it meant to live for himself, to embrace the unknown and trust that it would lead him somewhere meaningful. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, the answers would come when he took the first step. Later that afternoon, as Marcus sat in a quiet cafe overlooking the ocean, he took out his notebook and began sketching out his ideas for the company. His passion was flowing onto the page, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he was doing something that felt purely for him. It wasn't about pleasing anyone else, it was about creating something that mattered, something that could make a real difference. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the world in golden light, Marcus smiled to himself. He was no longer running from the weight of his past. He was finally running toward something, toward his own future. And that future? It was his to shape. The days that followed were a whirlwind of ideas, decisions, and uncertainties. Marcus had returned to the quiet town of his childhood, feeling the pull of home more than he expected. Costa Rica had given him the space to breathe, to reconsider his life. But now, back in his apartment, he was faced with the reality of the next step, making his vision a reality. He spent long nights at his kitchen table, a laptop in front of him, researching sustainable tourism, eco-friendly initiatives, and how to start a business from the ground up. It was exhilarating but exhausting. There were times when he doubted whether he could really make it happen, times when the weight of the task ahead seemed insurmountable. He thought back to that moment on the beach, when the idea first struck him, and felt the same spark of determination. But that spark was now mingled with fear. Fear of failure. Fear of being trapped once again in something that wasn't his. Fear of his father's expectations creeping back in. And, perhaps the hardest fear to confront, fear of his own potential. Maybe it's not too late to join the family business, Marcus muttered to himself as he sat on the couch, staring at the blank wall. Maybe I'm just fooling myself thinking I can create something new. A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. He opened it to find Ben standing in the hallway, a bag of takeout in one hand. "Thought you might need some food and company," Ben said with a smile, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Marcus chuckled, despite himself. "You know me too well." They sat down at the kitchen table, unpacking the food. It was the first real conversation they'd had in days, and Marcus realized how much he missed Ben's presence in his life. Ben was his constant, someone who didn't need to be convinced or swayed. He simply believed in Marcus, in a way that no one else did. "So, how's it going?" Ben asked as he took a bite of his food. Marcus hesitated before speaking. It's going. But I don't know. I'm trying to make this work, but I keep second-guessing myself. It's like I'm afraid to move forward, afraid I'll fail and end up where I started." Ben leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to consider Marcus's words. "You know, I get it. But I think you're looking at this all wrong. You're not just trying to create a business, you're trying to create something meaningful. And that's not easy. But it's also what makes it worth doing." Marcus met his friend's gaze, his chest tightening. "But what if it doesn't work out? What if I end up losing everything?" Ben smiled gently. "What if it does work out? What if this is the thing that finally gives you the freedom you've been looking for?" Marcus paused, the question lingering in the air. "I don't know, Ben. It's not like it's just going to fall into place. It feels like there's too much at stake." "Maybe," Ben agreed. "But that's the thing about taking risks. You don't always get to control the outcome, but you control the decision to take that first step. And once you've taken it, the next one becomes a little easier." Marcus thought about Ben's words, letting them sink in. He had always been the cautious one, the one who played by the rules. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to take a leap. To trust himself. To trust that if he took the first step toward his future, the rest would follow. After dinner, Ben stayed for a while longer, talking about everything from old memories to new adventures. But Marcus's mind was elsewhere, consumed by the thoughts of his business, of what he wanted to create, of how it would all fit together. The conversation didn't erase his doubts, but it did give him the clarity he needed. As Ben left for the evening, Marcus stood in the doorway and watched his friend walk down the hall. A small voice inside him whispered that this was his moment, the moment he had been waiting for. The moment where he could leave behind the fears that had held him back for so long. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a new sense of determination. He would no longer allow the weight of his father's expectations, or the fear of failure, to define him. He would start small, one step at a time, but he would move forward. He made a list, jotting down his goals for the next few months: research, networking, building a business plan. He didn't have it all figured out, but he knew that if he focused on one thing at a time, it would come together. For the first time in a while, Marcus felt a sense of purpose. It wasn't about finding success in the way others defined it, it was about creating something that was his own, something that mattered to him. And that, he realized, was worth all the risks. As the days passed, Marcus worked tirelessly, putting in long hours. He reached out to experts in sustainable tourism, talked to community leaders about the impact of ecotourism, and learned the ins and outs of business development. He sought advice from mentors and talked to Ben whenever he needed a boost of confidence. The foundation for his business began to take shape, and while it wasn't easy, it felt right. Several weeks later, Marcus was sitting in a small meeting room with a group of potential investors. His heart raced as he presented his vision for the ecotourism business, explaining how it would not only support local communities but also raise awareness about the importance of sustainability in travel. He could feel the pressure of the moment, the weight of his own self-doubt creeping in. But as he spoke, something shifted. He found his confidence, his conviction in what he was building. This wasn't just another business pitch, it was his future. And he believed in it. The investors listened, their expressions unreadable. When he finished, there was a long silence. Marcus held his breath, waiting. Finally, one of the investors spoke. "This is exactly the kind of initiative we're looking for," she said, her voice warm. "We're in. We want to partner with you." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. He had done it. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, staring at the email confirming the partnership. His hands trembled slightly as he read the message again. This was it. His dream was becoming a reality. He leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. There were still many challenges ahead, and he knew the road wouldn't be easy. But he had taken the first step, and he was no longer afraid to move forward. For the first time in a long time, Marcus smiled. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Marcus found himself buried in meetings, conference calls, and research as he laid the groundwork for his ecotourism business. He worked tirelessly, often well into the night, making sure that every detail was perfect, every connection was made, and every step was calculated. Despite the excitement of finally seeing his vision taking shape, there was an undercurrent of anxiety that Marcus couldn't shake. The pressure to succeed, to prove that his idea was not just another dream but a viable and meaningful business, weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just about the money, or the success, or the recognition. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of creating something lasting. Something that could make a real impact. He had spent so many years living in the shadow of his father's expectations, trying to live up to a legacy that was never really his. Now, with this new venture, he was forging his own path, and it terrified him. The investors who had signed on were eager to see results, and Marcus knew he had to deliver. They believed in him, and that belief was both a gift and a burden. Every time he spoke with them, every time they asked for updates, he felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. One afternoon, as Marcus sat in a meeting room with his team, reviewing the latest developments, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his father was calling. His chest tightened. It had been a few weeks since their last conversation. They had both agreed to give each other space, to let Marcus take the lead on his own project. But now, as his father's name flashed on the screen, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He answered the call, forcing a calm tone into his voice. "Hey, Dad." "Marcus," his father said, his voice steady but with an edge of curiosity. "How's everything going with the business? Any progress?" Marcus swallowed. "It's going well. We've secured funding, and I've been working on building partnerships with local communities. It's a lot of work, but I'm making progress." "That's good to hear," his father replied, his tone guarded. "But remember, I'm here if you need help. You don't have to do this alone." One afternoon, as he walked through the local market, talking with vendors about how they could collaborate with his business, Marcus felt a strange sense of pride. These weren't just abstract concepts anymore, they were real people, real partnerships. His business wasn't just a theory, it was becoming something tangible. But as much as he was driven by the excitement of building something meaningful, there were moments when he felt overwhelmed. There were so many moving pieces, so many decisions to make. And with each new challenge, his self-doubt crept in. Late one night, as he reviewed a proposal from one of his partners, Marcus received a text from Ben. "How's everything going? You good?" Marcus smiled faintly at the message. Ben always knew when something was off, even when Marcus tried to hide it. "It's going, but I'm feeling the weight of it all. I'm not sure I'm cut out for this. I keep wondering if I'm in over my head." A few minutes later, Ben responded, "I get it. But remember, you don't have to have it all figured out right now. You just have to keep moving forward, one step at a time. You've always been the one who pushes through, even when it seems impossible. I believe in you, man." Marcus read Ben's message, and something inside him shifted. The fear was still there, but so was the determination. He had taken the first step, and no matter how difficult the journey became, he wasn't going to stop now. He had built this business for a reason, to make a difference, to create something that mattered, and to live a life that was authentically his own. With renewed resolve, Marcus set down his phone and stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. There were still many hurdles to overcome, but he was no longer going to let the fear of failure hold him back. He had a vision. He had the passion. And most importantly, he had the strength to keep going. Tomorrow, he would face the challenges ahead, knowing that with each step forward, he was building the future he had always dreamed of. Marcus was up before dawn, sipping his coffee as he stared out the window of his apartment. The city was still quiet, the streets empty, save for the occasional early riser. It was a calm before the storm. He had a meeting in an hour, and his mind was already racing with what he had to accomplish that day. The pressure to succeed was always there, but this morning, it felt heavier. There were decisions looming that could make or break his business. He knew the investors were eager to see the results, and though they had been supportive, there was an unspoken understanding that they expected more than just good intentions. They wanted tangible progress. The latest hurdle was the logistics of incorporating local, sustainable practices into his business. He had partnered with small villages to promote ecotourism, but the challenge was proving to be more difficult than he had imagined. Local resources were limited, and getting the community leaders on board was taking longer than expected. Despite his best efforts, he hadn't been able to meet the deadlines he had set, and the fear of disappointing the investors gnawed at him. He couldn't afford to fail. The thought of returning to the family business, where he had never truly fit in, still haunted him. This was his shot at something real, something of his own. His phone buzzed again, breaking his train of thought. It was another message from Ben. "How's it going? Still drowning in meetings?" Marcus smiled briefly, feeling a surge of gratitude for his friend's unwavering support. He quickly replied, "Yeah, it's been crazy. But I'm hanging in there. Just need to get these partnerships sorted." A few minutes later, Ben responded, "You got this, man. It's just a phase. Every big idea goes through growing pains. Push through." Marcus took a deep breath. Ben was right. Every business, no matter how well planned, went through its challenges. This was just another part of the journey. By 9 a.m., Marcus was in his office, sitting across from a local environmental expert named Carla. She was an expert in sustainable development and had been helping him map out the best ways to minimize the environmental impact of his tourism business. Today, they were discussing the implementation of a new waste management system for the eco-resorts. "So, Marcus, we're looking at a few different models here," Carla said, pulling up a set of figures on her laptop. "This model uses 30% less energy and recycles 80% of waste, but it will require an upfront investment of about $50,000. Marcus winced. The number was high, but it was also necessary if they wanted to stay true to their vision of sustainable tourism. He ran his fingers through his hair, thinking. "How long would it take to break even with this model?" he asked. Carla paused, running the numbers in her head. "About 3 years, if we maintain the right number of guests and manage our resources carefully. But it's a long-term investment. The environmental impact is undeniable. Marcus nodded, but his mind was already racing through the figures. He could see the value of the long-term investment, but the upfront cost was a significant hurdle. It was just one of many challenges he was facing, but it felt like the most pressing one. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "It's worth it. We'll find the resources to make it work." Carla smiled. "I thought you might say that." Marcus left the meeting feeling both satisfied and uneasy. There was a certain thrill in taking risks, but this was a big one. He was placing his faith in a vision, but with every step, the stakes grew higher. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of decisions, calls, and follow-ups. As the evening approached, Marcus found himself back in his apartment, staring at his laptop screen. He had finally finished the day's tasks, but his mind was still spinning with all that was yet to be done. Just as he was about to close his laptop, there was a knock at the door. Marcus opened it to find Ben standing in the hallway with a bottle of wine in his hand. "I figured you might need a break," Ben said, grinning. "You've been working non-stop." Marcus smiled gratefully, stepping aside to let his friend in. "You have no idea how right you are. I feel like I'm losing track of time." Ben handed him the bottle of wine. "I thought we could toast to your progress. I know things seem overwhelming right now, but you're moving forward. That's all that matters." They sat down at the kitchen table, and Ben poured them each a glass. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus allowed himself to relax, to enjoy the moment with his friend. The weight of the day slowly lifted as they talked about everything except business, old jokes, shared memories, and their plans for the future. After a while, Ben's expression turned more serious. "Hey, I know this is tough. But you're doing something incredible here. Not just for yourself, but for the community, for the environment. You're building something that matters. You're not going to let a few bumps in the road stop you, right?" Marcus's heart swelled at the sincerity in his friend's words. He knew Ben believed in him, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real, more possible. "No," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I'm not going to stop. I'm not giving up now." The next day, Marcus met with the investors to present the new waste management proposal and provide an update on the progress they had made. He felt a nervous flutter in his stomach, but he knew this was a critical moment. This was where they would either buy into his vision or walk away. The meeting was tense at first. Marcus outlined the changes they were making, the investments they were committing to, and how they planned to scale the business. He saw the skepticism in their eyes, but he also saw something else, a flicker of hope, a recognition that his vision might just work. Finally, one of the investors, a woman named Rebecca, leaned forward, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. "I'll admit," she said, "I was unsure about some of your earlier ideas. But after hearing this and seeing the progress you've made, I'm on board. Let's take this to the next level." Marcus felt a rush of relief wash over him. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. The investors weren't just backing him financially, they were beginning to believe in his vision, in what he was trying to create. He left the meeting with a sense of accomplishment. There were still plenty of obstacles ahead, but today felt like a turning point. He had taken a risk, and it was starting to pay off. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Marcus felt ready to face whatever came next. The days following the breakthrough with the investors felt like a blur to Marcus. For the first time since he started this venture, there was a sense of validation in the air, but the pressure continued to mount. With new funding in place, expectations were higher than ever. Every move he made now had to be calculated, every decision had a ripple effect. He spent countless hours in meetings, coordinating logistics, planning the final stages of the ecotourism development, and ensuring the sustainability practices would work. But, as the project reached its critical phases, new challenges appeared, challenges that he hadn't anticipated, that even the investors hadn't foreseen. One particularly frustrating afternoon, as Marcus reviewed progress reports in his office, his phone buzzed. It was an urgent message from Carla. "Marcus, we have a problem. The local water supply project we were depending on is running into serious issues. There are regulatory hurdles, and they've just denied our application for the needed permits." Marcus's stomach sank as he read the message. The water system was the cornerstone of the eco-resorts. Without it, they couldn't provide guests with safe, clean water, let alone implement the sustainable model they had promised. He quickly texted back, "What are our options? I'm working on finding alternatives, but it's going to delay things. We might need to rethink our approach or explore other solutions. We'll talk tomorrow, but I wanted you to know." Marcus felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. A delay at this stage meant losing time, precious time that he couldn't afford. Not with the investors eager for results, not with his reputation on the line. The clock was ticking. He sat back in his chair, breathing deeply, trying to regain his focus. It was a setback, but it wasn't the end. He knew this business was going to face obstacles, but he had to stay focused, resilient. This was just another hurdle he needed to overcome. The next morning, Marcus met with Carla at the site where the eco-resort was under construction. They stood in the early morning light, overlooking the land, and discussed the water supply issues in more detail. Carla was deep in thought. "The original plan would have required us to build an underground reservoir, but without the permits, that's out of the question. We might have to look into rainwater harvesting or sourcing water from a nearby river, but both options come with their own complications." Marcus nodded, considering their options. "We can't afford another delay. Is there any way we can move forward with a temporary solution while we work on the long-term plan?" Carla's eyes brightened as she considered this. "I think that's possible. We could implement a smaller-scale water filtration system using locally sourced materials, which would buy us some time. But we'll need to adjust our overall budget, and it will require some more negotiations with the local authorities." Marcus thought for a moment. This wasn't the ideal solution, but it was better than nothing. "Let's do it," he said, with more conviction than he felt. "We'll make it work." As they began adjusting plans to accommodate the new water strategy, Marcus received another unexpected call, this time, from one of the investors, Rebecca. "Marcus, we've been reviewing the budget reports for the next quarter, and we're seeing some discrepancies. Have you been able to account for the extra costs of the water systems, the logistics, and the increased construction fees?" she asked, her voice calm but direct. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He had anticipated some cost increases, but nothing quite like this. The delays, the unforeseen costs, everything seemed to be piling up at once. "I've been working on it," Marcus replied, trying to sound confident. "There are a few unexpected challenges with the local water project, but we're adapting. We're exploring alternative options and reworking the budget to make sure everything is covered." Rebecca's tone softened slightly. "I understand that there are always bumps along the way. But we need to ensure that this project doesn't get too far off track. I'm confident you're capable of handling this, Marcus, but it's important to keep us in the loop with updates." "I will," Marcus assured her, feeling the weight of her words. This wasn't just about the business anymore. This was his credibility on the line. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with everything that could go wrong. What if the investors lost faith in him? What if the community couldn't handle the changes? What if the environmental impact of the project turned out to be greater than he had anticipated? He had spent so much time building this dream, this vision for a better, more sustainable future, but now the cracks were starting to show. Could he really pull it all together? His phone buzzed again. It was a text from Ben. "Hey, man, you good? I can tell something's up." Marcus sighed deeply, sitting up and rubbing his face with his hands. He quickly typed back, "Things are tough. Water issues, budget issues. It feels like everything is falling apart." Ben replied almost immediately, "Look, I know it's hard. But remember why you started this. You're doing something that matters, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. You've got a team that believes in you, and you've got people who are counting on you. You've got this." Marcus read Ben's message and smiled faintly, grateful for his friend's constant encouragement. The challenges weren't over, but he knew he couldn't afford to give up now. He had come too far to let one setback derail everything. He took a deep breath and typed back, "Thanks, Ben. I needed that." With a new sense of resolve, Marcus closed his phone and climbed back into bed. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. The next few weeks were marked by intense focus and tireless work. Marcus worked with Carla to implement the temporary water filtration systems and kept the investors informed about every development. Every decision felt like a delicate balancing act. Too many mistakes and the entire project could come crashing down, but too many delays could also lead to failure. As the first eco-resort finally neared completion, Marcus allowed himself a small moment of triumph. The resort wasn't perfect, it wasn't everything he had dreamed it would be, but it was a start. A foundation for something bigger, something more impactful. Standing on the site, looking out over the lush land, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment. Despite everything, he had managed to get this far. It wasn't a perfect journey, but it was his journey. And he wasn't about to let it end now. The day Marcus stood before the final version of the eco-resort, a wave of pride washed over him. His hard work, the sleepless nights, and countless struggles had led to this moment. The resort was far from perfect, but it was functional, sustainable, and ready for guests. As he walked through the open-air corridors, past the solar-powered cabins and into the heart of the property, he couldn't help but marvel at what they had accomplished. Yet, with the success of the project came an undercurrent of unease. The pressure from investors had not disappeared, if anything, it had only grown stronger. The real test was how the public would respond, and more importantly, how well the resort would generate the revenue they needed to move forward with the other locations. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Rebecca. "Marcus, we've been reviewing the projections for the next quarter, and we're seeing some concerns. We'll need to discuss the visitor data and your marketing strategy." Marcus's stomach churned. The projections had been a concern all along. The challenge was not just about providing a sustainable product, it was about convincing people that it was worth their time and money. He stood still for a moment, gathering himself. This was his chance to show the investors that his vision was more than just an ideal, it was a viable business. He had to turn this moment of doubt into a turning point. He quickly texted back, "Let's meet tomorrow to go over it in detail. I'll have all the numbers ready for you." The next day, Marcus sat in the conference room, flipping through a stack of reports in front of him. He knew he had to present the resort's visitor data in a way that showed potential growth. The investors wanted hard numbers, but Marcus understood that the future of the business was about more than just figures, it was about creating a narrative that aligned with their values. Rebecca and a few of the other investors arrived, settling in around the table. There was a quiet tension in the air. They weren't just reviewing numbers, they were deciding the fate of everything Marcus had worked so hard for. "Marcus," Rebecca began, flipping through the reports he had provided, "we've been impressed with the eco-resort's sustainable design, but we're still not seeing the level of interest we expected from potential guests. The projections for the next quarter are underwhelming, especially considering the investment we've made." Marcus cleared his throat, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. "I understand, and I take full responsibility. We're in a unique position. This isn't just about marketing a resort. It's about educating people on the benefits of sustainable travel, and that takes time. We're competing with large-scale resorts, and we don't have the same resources for mass marketing." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "That may be true, but time is a luxury we don't have. We need to see results sooner rather than later. What's your plan to boost interest in the coming months?" Marcus took a deep breath. We're targeting niche markets, people who are already passionate about ecotourism. The idea is to build a loyal customer base through word of mouth and partnerships with eco-friendly brands. We're also leveraging social media influencers in the sustainability space to promote the resort. But we also need to offer incentives, like discounts for repeat guests and referral programs. The investors exchanged glances, and Marcus could see that his words were landing. They weren't completely sold, but they were listening. You've got the vision, Marcus, Rebecca said. But now we need to see it translated into numbers. We need clear milestones and deadlines. And if you don't hit them, we'll have to reevaluate where we go from here. Marcus nodded. He understood the stakes. I'll have a new, revised marketing plan by the end of this week. I'll focus on measurable growth metrics and align the targets with the resources we currently have. We won't let you down. The investors stood up, nodding in approval, but Marcus could feel the weight of their expectations settling around him. He had given them his best pitch, but the hard work had only just begun. He had a vision, yes, but now it was time to make that vision profitable. After the meeting, Marcus found himself walking back to the site of the eco-resort. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape. He stood there for a moment, soaking in the beauty of it all. This place was everything he had dreamed of, a peaceful oasis, a sanctuary for both guests and the environment. But he wasn't here just for the view. He was here because he knew that if he didn't make this work, everything could come crashing down. The resort was only the beginning. There were other locations, more opportunities, but also more risks. The business could succeed, he knew it could. But the pressure of the next steps was overwhelming. How could he make people see the value of what he was doing when the world was so accustomed to luxury and convenience? Marcus, a voice called out from behind him. He turned to find Ben walking toward him, a grin on his face. Hey, Marcus said, managing a smile. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, Ben teased. You've been working non-stop. I thought you might need a break. Marcus chuckled. A break? I wish I had the time. The investors want results, Ben. I don't know if I can deliver. The numbers are just not where they need to be. Ben's expression grew serious. I get it. But listen to me, Marcus. You're doing something no one else is. You're showing people a better way to travel, to live, to experience the world. That's powerful. And it's going to take time for people to understand that. Marcus looked at him, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't the first time Ben had given him this speech, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. Thanks, Marcus said, his voice steady now. I needed that more than you know. Ben clapped him on the back. You got this. Just keep doing what you're doing. The rest will follow. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the reassurance from his friend seep into him. The journey was far from over, and the challenges were only going to get tougher. But as he stood there, looking out over the land he had helped build, he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't giving up. Not now. The weeks after the investors' meeting were a blur of calculations, strategy, and sleepless nights. Marcus threw himself into refining his approach, determined to prove that his vision wasn't just a lofty ideal, it was a business model that could succeed. He worked with his marketing team to implement changes, focusing on creating engaging content, collaborating with influencers in the sustainable living space, and offering exclusive promotions. Every email he sent, every decision he made felt like it could tip the scale one way or the other. Despite his best efforts, the visitor numbers still weren't where they needed to be. The pressure was becoming suffocating. The investors had given him clear benchmarks. If he didn't meet them by the end of the month, they would have to reconsider their support. One evening, as Marcus sat alone in his office, reviewing yet another set of disappointing analytics, his phone buzzed. It was Carla. Marcus, we need to talk. There's a situation here on site. His heart dropped. What now? He muttered under his breath as he called her back. Marcus, Carla's voice came through, tight with stress. We've had a major issue with the solar panel system. A storm rolled through last night and damaged a significant portion of it. We're looking at some serious delays in repairs and a potential halt in production for a few days. This is going to impact the resort's ability to operate smoothly. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. The delays never seemed to stop. It felt like every time he took 2 steps forward, something else knocked him back. How bad is it? He asked, his voice strained. Bad enough that we'll need to reconfigure the entire system. It's going to take time, and with the investors already on edge, I'm worried about how this will look. Marcus ran a hand over his face. The solar panels were critical to the resort's sustainability model. Without them, they couldn't stay true to their eco-friendly promises, and that was a foundation he couldn't afford to crack. I'll be there in an hour, Marcus said, trying to keep his composure. An hour later, Marcus arrived on site. Carla and a few of the technicians were gathered around the damaged panels, assessing the situation. The once gleaming solar array now looked like a broken shell of its former self, a stark reminder that even the best-laid plans could be derailed by forces outside of their control. He walked up to Carla, his footsteps heavy in the sand. How bad is it? He repeated. We can fix it, but it's going to take time. A few days, maybe more. We'll need to source replacement parts and bring in specialists. I'm already on the phone with some suppliers, but this is going to push back our timeline. Marcus stood silently, staring at the damage. The weight of the situation felt unbearable. He knew that the investors were already nervous. Any further delays could push them to pull out of the project, and with everything else on the line, he couldn't afford to lose their support. Carla put a hand on his shoulder. Hey, we'll get through this. You've been through worse, right? Marcus gave her a tight smile. Yeah, but that doesn't make this any easier. That night, as Marcus lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts kept circling back to the same question, was this all worth it? He had sacrificed so much for this project, his time, his money, his relationships, and yet the weight of it all was starting to feel too heavy to bear. The setbacks, the constant pressure, the never-ending cycle of fixes and repairs, it felt like he was losing sight of the dream he had started with. But then his phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Ben. Marcus, I know things are tough right now, but remember that you've come so far. It's never easy at the start, but if you keep pushing, you'll get there. You've got a team that believes in you, and more importantly, you believe in yourself. Don't lose sight of that. Marcus sat up in bed, reading Ben's words over and over again. The weight on his shoulders didn't magically disappear, but somehow, Ben's message gave him a sense of clarity. The journey hadn't been easy, but it was his to navigate. No one else was going to do it for him, and if he gave up now, he would never know if it could have worked. With a deep breath, he got out of bed and picked up the phone to call Carla. The next morning, Marcus and Carla worked late into the day, mapping out the repairs to the solar system and coming up with an alternative plan to keep the resort running while the panels were being fixed. They sourced generators to maintain power, and Marcus contacted the investors, explaining the situation honestly but with a clear action plan for how they were handling the setback. The investors were understandably frustrated, but Marcus's transparency and his clear strategy for moving forward gave them confidence. They weren't thrilled about the delay, but they appreciated his determination. Marcus, Rebecca said during the call, we're going to give you some more time. We understand these things happen. But you need to make sure you stay ahead of these issues. Don't let them catch you off guard again. I won't, Marcus assured her. This is a hiccup, not the end of the road. By the end of the week, the solar panel system was up and running again, and although the resort had experienced some downtime, the damage wasn't as severe as it could have been. Marcus continued to push forward with the revised marketing strategy, focusing on increasing visibility and building anticipation for the next phase of the resort's development. He also worked tirelessly to streamline operations and ensure that every part of the business was functioning as efficiently as possible. The numbers were still slow to rise, but Marcus could feel a shift in the air. His vision was still alive. The resort was still operational. And slowly, his confidence was beginning to return. This project wasn't just about the investors or the bottom line. It was about creating something that mattered. And no matter how many setbacks he faced, he wasn't ready to let go of that dream. As he stood once more at the edge of the property, looking out over the ocean in the distance, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would still be difficult, but he was ready for whatever came next. It had been several months since Marcus had faced that difficult meeting with the investors, the solar panel setback, and the constant pressure to turn his vision into a reality. Now, as he stood at the edge of the resort's main deck, watching the sun rise over the tranquil ocean, he realized how far they had come. The resort, once a dream that seemed too ambitious to succeed, was slowly but surely becoming a reality. The numbers were finally showing promise. Visitors had begun to return in increasing numbers, especially after the new sustainability-focused marketing campaign had taken off. Marcus had doubled down on his strategy to target eco-conscious travelers, and it was starting to pay off. Word of mouth was spreading, influencers were posting about their stays, and partnerships with eco-friendly brands were helping boost the resort's visibility. But it wasn't just the numbers that made Marcus feel like they were on the right track, it was the feeling in the air. The staff was more confident, the guests were happy, and the energy of the place had changed. There was a palpable sense of excitement and optimism among everyone involved. He turned around to find Carla walking up to join him. She had been instrumental in keeping the operation running smoothly, especially during the rough patches. "You're quiet today," she said, a smile on her face as she took in the view beside him. Marcus chuckled softly. "I'm just taking it all in. I can't believe we made it this far. There were so many times when I thought we were going to crash and burn." Carla nodded, understanding the sentiment. "I think we've all felt that way at some point. But you didn't give up. You kept pushing. And now look at us. We've got something real here." Marcus smiled, but there was a touch of hesitation in his eyes. "I know we've come a long way. But we're still not out of the woods. The investors are watching closely, and there's always the risk of a downturn. We need to stay sharp." "We will," Carla said, her voice firm. "We've learned from every mistake. We've adapted. That's what makes us stronger. This place is built on a foundation of resilience. You've created something that people want. And that's not something you can just undo." Marcus looked at her, grateful for her unwavering support. "You're right. We've come this far, and we're not stopping now." Just then, his phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Rebecca. "Marcus, I just wanted to reach out personally and say that we've been impressed with the progress. Your team has done incredible work, and the numbers are showing real promise. We're committed to this project." Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him as he read the message. The pressure hadn't disappeared, but the reassurance from the investors was a welcome reminder that they still had faith in him and the resort. "Thank you, Rebecca," Marcus quickly typed back. "We're just getting started. There's more to come, and I'm excited for what lies ahead." He put his phone down, his mind buzzing with ideas for the future. The resort was still in its early stages, but he could already see the potential for expansion. If they could make this location a success, the next step would be replicating the model in other parts of the world, creating a network of sustainable resorts that people could visit, knowing they were supporting a cause they believed in. "Big plans, huh?" Carla said, giving him a knowing look. Marcus grinned. "Absolutely. The hard part's over, but the real work is just beginning. We've got the momentum now. We just need to keep it going. The sun had fully risen, casting a warm glow across the landscape. The resort, still a work in progress, had a beauty of its own, raw, genuine, and full of promise. Marcus knew it wouldn't be an easy road ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt certain that they were on the right path. "You know, I've been thinking," Marcus said, his voice thoughtful. "What if we could take this model global? Imagine building resorts in places that are truly in need of sustainable tourism. We could create eco-friendly havens around the world, protect the environment, and change the way people think about travel." Carla's eyes lit up. "That sounds incredible. If anyone can make it happen, it's you, Marcus." He nodded, feeling the weight of the dream settle back into his chest. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that could truly make a difference. And he was ready to take that next step. As they walked together toward the main building, the sound of waves crashing against the shore in the distance, Marcus couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of hope. He had started with a dream, one that many people thought was impossible. But now, with each passing day, it was becoming something real. And that was all that mattered. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?